It's my great pleasure as Master of Birkbeck to welcome you to this second in our series of lectures celebrating the 100th anniversary of Birkbeck joining the University of London in 1920. And of course, all sorts of anniversaries are celebrated by different organisations, often not very meaningful in terms of the organisation as it is at the time of the celebration. This one, of course, is different because it is of vital importance to us to be part of the University of London. A number of you as alumni may well have studied part-time in the evening here, and the membership of the University of London, the fact that you get a University of London degree, indicates to everybody outside that this is not some sort of second-rate thing that is good enough for people who can't study during the day, but you could do better elsewhere. This is comparable to the other high-quality institutions of the University of London that teach during the day conventional 18-year-old students. So it's a very important anniversary for us, and we should remember perhaps George Armitage Smith, who was the principal at the time, who fought an incredible fight to get Birkbeck admitted to the University of London. It was not a sort of rollover whatever. The Principal of King's said that he would welcome Birkbeck into the University of London, but that Birkbeck should act as a sort of preparatory class for students who were not yet ready to go to university, and when Birkbeck had made them ready, then they could study at the level that King's and other institutions were prepared to do. Armitage Smith destroyed this by showing that in fact there was a higher proportion of sub-university courses at King's at that time than there was at Birkbeck. So eventually Birkbeck was admitted to the University of London in 1920, and we have hopefully flourished within the university ever since. Interestingly, George Armitage Smith reorganised the teaching of the college into 5 faculties, paralleling the 5 schools that we have today, although slightly different subject mix, of course, in 1896 when he first arrived. But something that I think renders it particularly appropriate, the way that we have done this, to invite each school to choose a particular speaker, internal, external, alumnus or not. And today we are very privileged that the School of Business, Economics and Informatics has chosen Sir Ed Davey, a distinguished alumnus of the college, of course, a master's graduate in economics from the college. Interestingly, Armitage Smith, as part of the price of joining the University of London, had to stop teaching economics at Birkbeck due to the LSE and the power of the LSE. Fortunately, it was reintroduced some years later in time for Ed to come here and study economics. And of course, he's had a very distinguished and continues to have a very distinguished career, being, of course, in the coalition government, Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, being at the moment the acting leader of the Liberal Democrats, perhaps with ambitions to go further. We won't necessarily go into that. And of course, he has attained many distinctions, including a knighthood, and most importantly, the Fellowship of Birkbeck, which was awarded to him as one of our most distinguished graduates over the long history of Birkbeck. And having had the portfolio of energy and climate change, he continued both in and out of Parliament to have a particular interest and a particular role in climate change. So tonight we are very privileged to welcome our distinguished alumnus and to invite him to give his lecture on the highly appropriate topic and highly topical topic of climate change. Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I hope the rest of London University are celebrating the fact that they're lucky to have a Birkbeck amongst them. We live in interesting times, and 2020 could be one of the most interesting years since 2016. Remember 2016? The US voted for Donald Trump, the UK voted for Brexit, and the same British Republic named the National Environment Research Council's new boaty Boatface. I can confirm that I didn't predict any of these outcomes, so I'm not going to make predictions for 2020, whether it's on the US elections or on the challenges of the Brexit negotiations, the first free trade talks in history seeking to make trade less free. But I do want to talk about the challenge of COP26. This year's UN climate change talks. He hosted in the UK for the first time this November, just after the US elections, and just as the Brexit negotiations are supposed to be concluding. Global Britain under Prime Minister Johnson has the chance to lead the world on these vital global climate change talks. Can our whiff-waff Prime Minister do it? Now, this lecture may disappoint some because my intention tonight is not to give you the many reasons why I'm sceptical about our Prime Minister, whether it's Johnson on Trump, Johnson on Brexit, or Johnson on climate. Let me simply say this about the Prime Minister. Now he's forced to come face to face with the reality of government and not the rhetoric he survived up till now, it will be interesting to see if he's been keeping secret some hidden talents all these years. Instead, my intention is to offer some thoughts and advice on how the British could regain climate leadership this year and culminate such efforts in Glasgow by concluding climate talks as successfully as the French did 5 years ago in Paris. I want to divide my lecture into 3 parts, drawing on my 3 years as Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, and of course, my 2 years studying part-time at Birkbeck for my MSc in Economics. Woven through my talk is the tensions and trade-offs between politics and economics, and the insight I hope to provide is based on what is fast becoming my own evolving approach to political leadership, which I would tentatively label liberal realism, this time applied to saving our planet. In the first part of my lecture, I want to argue that the pathway to global climate leadership begins by demonstrating far more credible and urgent climate policies at home. The UK needs both to state that the world is facing a climate emergency that requires urgent action, and prove that we at home are on an emergency footing, taking urgent action ourselves. Next, I will argue that Britain's climate leadership pathway must include a clear demonstration of how best both to engage ordinary people, citizens, voters, with the climate challenge and to win their active support for what hitherto have been considered politically challenging policies. So that climate emergency politics becomes something leaders of all countries want to embrace rather than run away from. Finally, at the critical international level, the challenge I see for Britain is to conjure up diplomatic magic to bring our fracturing world together for Glasgow's climate talks, and what may prove to be one of our last best chances to tackle the climate emergency, before the fires burn out of control and the flood levels rise beyond our control. In a world of Trump, Bolsonaro and Putin, of US-China trade wars, deliberate Amazonian destruction, and fossil-fueled conflicts, I don't underestimate the scale of this diplomatic challenge. But a Prime Minister who is serious about global Britain would surely want to take on this task. So here's how. Britain's domestic record on tackling climate change is actually quite good when compared internationally, despite the pace of progress slowing in the last 4 years. The Climate Change Performance Index, an independent monitoring tool that enables comparison of climate protection efforts and progress made by individual countries, regularly has the UK in the top 10 countries globally. Some argue our progress is partly down to offshoring our emissions to countries like China. In other words, we've only reduced our emissions because we now import the goods we consume from other countries rather than making them ourselves. Yet even when we correct for such deindustrialisation, Britain's climate record does seem to compare favourably with many similar countries. Nevertheless, I find it frustrating to see Conservative ministers bask in that record, when I would argue any relative success is largely down to the leadership of progressive political parties who have led the way and contributed by far the most, and indeed that we still need to do far more. Let's remember that Britain's first big intentional step forward was taken under Labour with the Climate Change Act in 2008. This was without doubt a landmark moment. The world's first comprehensive climate law, bringing serious targets, rolling carbon budgets, and an independent scrutineer, the Climate Change Committee. This was a huge political statement made possible by the seminal work by Professor Nick Stern, Economics of Climate Change, itself commissioned by Gordon Brown. I would then immodestly argue that Britain's policy framework received a major boost with the contribution of two Liberal Democrat Energy and Climate Change Secretaries of State between 2010 and 2015, Chris Huhne and myself. It's true this was a coalition government, yet for Conservatives to take much credit for the progress we've made flies in the face of the many fierce political battles I and the Lib Dems had to wage day in, day out to win for climate policy. Our strategic blocker was the then Chancellor George Osborne. He tried, amongst other things, to minimise support for low carbon power, especially renewables. I eventually outfoxed him after a year-long battle over what was then called the Levy Control Framework, a budget control mechanism for the subsidy payments then necessary to expand renewable electricity generation. It was arguably the toughest fight of the coalition, given the long-term significance of that victory. Yet George Osborne was hardly the only one. From Eric Pickles to Owen Paterson, the Conservatives lined up to thwart us. Pickles in particular tried to stop energy efficiency regulations becoming law, telling me once that regulations were communist. I worked my way around Mr. Pickles, got my energy efficiency regulation, minimum energy efficiency standards for the private rental sector, so I guess that makes me a communist. And Pickles was even worse when it came to using planning policy to stop investment into renewable power. Indeed, to my mind, he abused his planning powers as Secretary of State in his mission to try to stop the growth of onshore wind power. At one point, I even urged leading lights in the wind industry to take my fellow cabinet minister to court. I felt he was overstepping the mark so much in his efforts to stop our work on renewables. So it was largely despite the Conservatives, rather than because of them, that we managed inter alia to nearly quadruple Britain's renewable power, make Britain the world leader in offshore wind power, and legislate for green power auctions. And if you need any more evidence who should take the credit for the progress in the coalition, just look what happened afterwards. After the 2015 election, the Conservatives effectively banned onshore wind in England and Wales. They slashed solar subsidies far too quickly, decimating an early stage industry. They ditched our world-leading carbon capture and storage competition, scrapped our zero carbon homes law, privatised the Green Investment Bank, and I could go on. I recount these facts not simply to score a few political points, though for me, in this climate context at least, the Liberal Democrats did win. But my serious reason for this climate history is both to contextualise the need for a much more proactive, urgent British domestic response to the climate emergency, and to evidence that we can make much faster progress if we choose, and if we have the political will and leadership. Moreover, the success of Lib Dem renewables policy in government was far more historic than many recognise. I would argue an example of liberal realism in action, where we married a progressive vision on climate with a pragmatic and innovative approach to real-world business. Above all, we did this in what was then a radically new approach to managing subsidies for renewables. We transformed Britain's power industry by switching from an on-demand approach to subsidies, where the developer was guaranteed a particular subsidy level, so long as they met certain criteria, to a competitive model where the developer couldn't even be sure they would get any subsidy if another developer were to underbid them. Our market-based auction policy helped dramatically reduce the price of renewable power, particularly offshore wind. Now wind power is price competitive with fossil fuel generated electricity, even without taking into account the unacceptable cost of the pollution from gas and coal power stations. To give you a sense of this green economy revolution, let me talk prices. For electricity, prices are quoted as the cost of a unit of electricity, measured in terms of megawatts per hour. I signed my first major offshore wind farm contract in 2013 at the eye-watering price of £140 per megawatt hour. A price can be 3 times the then market price of power. And I've been criticised by the National Audit Office for signing such early contracts at such high prices. But I like to believe that I was right and they were wrong. For without priming the industry as we did, we would not have provided the stability and confidence for the private sector to invest for the long term. We wouldn't, for example, have seen the massive investment by Siemens in a wind turbine blade factory in Hull, bringing 1,000 climate jobs to that city. We wouldn't have built up competition in the supply chain that proved so essential to achieving everything from scale economies to manufacturing innovation. So thanks both to the pump priming and the competitive subsidy auction, the price of offshore wind electricity tumbled. So that after only 6 years, rather than offshore wind power coming in at £140 per megawatt hour, we saw prices as low as £40 per megawatt hour, below the wholesale market price, heralding a future of subsidy-free green power. This is nothing short of a revolution in Britain's electricity generation, and is helping us take coal off the grid far faster than countries like Germany. And politically, our offshore wind success has made it far more difficult for the Conservatives to reverse our progress, even if they have slowed it. Indeed, it's become increasingly difficult for even this government to ignore the increasingly strong economic and financial case for renewables. Yet Britain has to do so much more to get our own carbon house in order. This is not a moment for reluctant converts. Given the evidence of dangerous climate change, Britain must be accelerating climate action. Since it's clearer than ever that we face a climate emergency, now is not the time for the UK to preen itself and complacently stroll towards a little more action sometime in the future. Now is the time to sound the alarm, draw up emergency action plans and act on them. Let me give a few practical examples of action that we could take in Britain if we want to show the world we are serious again on our own climate policy. On green power, deployment of offshore wind should go faster. And we now need further strategic support for innovation and early deployment of less mature technologies in tidal and marine power, especially tidal lagoons and tidal stream turbines. We must diversify and grow the UK's future green electricity options, and we have to get serious again about carbon capture and storage, both for electricity generation and industrial decarbonisation. And when it comes to backup power and the storage of electricity, when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, the government has dragged its feet shockingly. For me, as we tackle the price challenge of green power, the next challenge was always going to be renewables intermittency issues. So from 2021, we will have the option of using cheap Norwegian hydropower as a sort of remote battery backup for our system. Once National Grid and Norway's Statnett have completed construction of the interconnector cable project I signed off on in March 2015. What will be the world's longest subsea power cable will link our power grid to Norway's. So in seconds, green hydropower can be available to our system. There's huge potential for many more such economically sensible, climate-friendly backup interconnector projects, connecting the UK's grid to green power in Scandinavia, on the continent, in the Republic of Ireland, and even with Iceland's abundant geothermal power. Yet government energy policy has recently languished in indecision and steered away from the notion of further European integration of our power markets. Brexit ideology over energy market reality. On storing electricity, using technologies ranging from batteries to pumped hydro storage, the technology-neutral capacity market I established helped incentivise some storage capacity onto the grid. And alongside National Grid's own development of so-called frequency response services, there has actually been a quiet revolution in the UK in power storage at scale. But once again, indecision over energy policy has meant the pace of regulation and system design, so crucial for future stages of storage deployment, has simply not had any priority. This is not the action of a government seized by a climate emergency. Of course, our red bus-loving Prime Minister wants us all to believe that when it comes to green transport, we are in the climate fast lane. I'm almost surprised he hasn't run adverts to that effect on the side of a bus. And to be fair, it's true that on green transport, the government are making some of the right noises and decisions at long last. From cycling to buses to high-speed 2, will be church to deny signs of progressive potential. But the threat of the third runway at Heathrow still looms over a truly sustainable transport policy for Britain. Boris Johnson could win genuine climate plaudits were he to keep his promise and lie down in front of the Heathrow bulldozers, metaphorically. When it comes to electric vehicles, the government tried to take credit for bringing forward the ban on new petrol and diesel cars from 2040 to 2035. Yet 2035 still means the UK lags behind the ambition of countries like Sweden, Ireland, the Netherlands, Israel and Denmark, who are opting for 2030, or even 2025 in the case of Norway. Many expect even larger countries like Germany to opt for 2030. If the UK did as well, just imagine the impact on the automotive industry. Just imagine how fast electric vehicle prices would tumble. Likewise, we need far more urgency and leadership when it comes to replacing the methane gas we use as our main energy source for heating space, for heating water, and for cooking. Decarbonising Britain's heating systems is widely thought to be amongst the most challenging climate policy challenges we face this decade. Experts still seem divided between the electrification of heat, with heat pumps and so on, and the possibility of repurposing the existing gas network, boilers and appliances, with a zero carbon alternative to methane, such as hydrogen. Answering this policy choice dilemma ought now to be a priority, but there's little evidence of ministers seizing and seeing its importance. Above all, the government's failure to launch major hydrogen trials at scale to test the viability of a non-fossil fuel gas for heating looks increasingly like a big mistake. So from green power through to zero carbon transport and heat, we need far more urgency. Yet my main demand of government, to prove greater global leadership by example here in the UK, is to focus on capitalism itself and the rules of capitalism in the UK. For if we're going to shift, and to catalyse the shift from dirty energy to clean energy, and to see a response that is equal to the scale and urgency of the climate emergency challenge, we have to go back to how our current economic system is working. We have to begin with a philosophy that says markets are our servants, not our masters, and therefore it is totally legitimate for a democracy to impose new rules and new regulations on our capital markets. It's not communism. Be they London Stock Exchange or our banks, pension funds or the debt markets, regulations are needed to turn these markets green. In what I've called the decarbonisation of capitalism, I propose a whole new set of climate laws for the city to require the calculation, recognition and integration of climate risk into investment decisions. From mandatory disclosure and reporting of fossil fuel investments in a financial institution's balance sheet, to requirements for large firms in the corporate and financial sectors to publish their own long-term strategy for moving to net zero. I'm particularly enthused about new climate accounting rules. After all, there's nothing more enthusing than accountancy. But never forget the accountants if you want to make money work for you. Imagine if we required all audits on larger businesses and financial institutions to include a new set of net zero accounts. Accounts where any fossil fuel assets on a firm's balance sheet or investment portfolio after 2045 had to be given a value of zero. Imagine the impact on share prices and the market's long-term valuation of those firms. people are already discussing the concept of climate insolvency, whereby a business or a bank is unable to show any net worth once its exposure to climate risk and climate valuations are properly revealed. Such ideas are where truly radical climate policy must now go. And if Britain were to lead and be the first to green our financial markets and develop climate capitalism, we really could claim to be global leaders on climate again. But demonstrating climate leadership at home, walking the walk, is a necessary condition for global climate leadership. It's clearly not sufficient. To convince the world to follow such a pathway, Britain has to convince world leaders that the climate pathway could work politically for them too. Given the huge diversity of political systems and energy resources globally, I don't pretend that will be easy. But my perhaps surprising conclusion is that it may be easier than people think. It will involve taking on vested interests, of course, but above all, it must involve taking the people with you. In today's divided politics, this might seem like a pipe dream. In Britain over the past 3 years, Brexit has torn through our politics, infecting and affecting every area of our economy and media. But a small, hardy band of activists and politicians has successfully managed to keep climate emergency into the headlines. This has been no mean feat. It has taken organisation, dedication and cooperation between progressives from many different parties and none. In many businesses, this has taken climate action from being the pet project of a couple of employees or a cheap attempt to seem socially responsible to a boardroom priority. In the media, we have turned the issue from a mere Hugger Husky colour supplement into front-page headlines and prime-time election debates, blocks of ice included. In global politics, we have taken it from the disastrous Copenhagen summit to the Paris Agreement ratified by every nation on the planet, barring a few like Iran and Turkey. Although admittedly, Donald Trump came to office and preferred to side with Erdogan and the Ayatollah than the rest of the planet. But the UN's COP in 2015 in Paris was a landmark moment. For many of us who were involved in helping to make it happen, the Paris Agreement and the years of work leading to it was the most important success of our careers. And COP this year in Glasgow is the most important global gathering since Paris in 2015. Britain, as host, has a chance to map out a new global approach to the climate emergency for the next decade. But the world is not the same place it was in 2015. Where there was Obama, we now have Trump. Where Britain was leading the EU to be more ambitious, to exercise global influence, we now have Brexit. But on the progressive side of the scale, we have new weights we can use to offset the climate deniers. From Greta Thunberg to the school protests, from the evidence from the fires of the Amazon to the burning bushfires of Australia. Our challenge is to turn the much greater awareness of populations around the world into global political action. In the UK, we have an opportunity to lead this. Despite everything, we are more united in the need for more action. Throughout our society, I sense a greater impatience for that action now. But we must harness that impatience to empower this year's climate talks in Glasgow's COP to address the climate emergency with urgency. But that will require a new political approach. We must fling open the doors of the UN climate talks to different voices, the campaigners, the NGOs, the charities, and a cross-section of politicians, especially those who do not happen to sit behind a mop of blonde hair and a dispatch box. Those new voices from civil society and politicians and political parties across the Parliament and across assemblies in our family of nations must play a much bigger and much more serious role in scrutinising this government's approach to Glasgow's COP, before, during and after. Such a scrutinising group logically follows on from the work currently underway in the Climate Assembly UK, a citizens' assembly commissioned by six cross-party common select committees due to report later this spring. If the UK can demonstrate that such participative, deliberative approaches to forming and informing climate policy can work and have real value, and can help citizens and voters to embrace the changes we need, this could make a powerful contribution to reassuring more sceptical politicians. Given we know a future net zero economy and society will require changes in everything from how we travel to what we eat, such reassurances have the power to help catalyse more urgent global climate action. So let me finally focus on COP26, the UN climate talks in November, and how the UK can use the opportunity of hosting the COP to regain leadership. And I should start by wishing Alok Sharma, the new president of the COP, appointed today, the very best of luck. Alok Sharma now has a vital job to do, and it falls to him to try to reassert UK leadership. It won't be easy, given the preparations for the COP so far appear to have been shambolic, but it is in everyone's interest Alok and the UK succeeds. So what would success look like? The key climate objective for this COP is for every country to make new public commitments to take more ambitious climate action, so that when we add every country's commitments up together, the world's combined promises would keep the world below 1.5 degrees. Let me give a little more background on this, as it's fairly crucial to understanding the challenge. These country-specific climate commitments are called in the jargon their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. Dreamt up at the Lima COP in Peru in 2014, the NDCs quickly became central to the climate talks, especially the crucial Paris Climate Treaty, when most nations began to set out their individual NDCs. To date, the sum total of published NDCs would leave the world emitting way more greenhouse gases than would be consistent with keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees. So we need, urgently, more ambitious climate commitments. And this year's Glasgow COP26 would be seen as a success if countries significantly raise their level of ambition in their NDCs, so the world moves to a climate pathway where we are collectively promising to reduce our combined emissions fast enough to keep warming below 1.5. Now this is a challenging diplomatic ask, and it will become really tough if Donald Trump wins re-election just before Glasgow. Like-minded world leaders could then use American withdrawal from the COP process, or American lack of ambition in the COP process, for an excuse not to act. Remember, the success of the Paris Treaty was partly down to the strong leadership of President Obama. So what should Boris Johnson be doing? What should Alok Sharma be doing? My advice would be to have 4 priority focuses: Europe, China, India, and the USA. Europe first, because the EU as a whole remains easily our closest ally on climate, as on so much. We should keep our European colleagues on the inside and by our side throughout the COP. At the 3 UN COPs when I led the British delegation at the climate talks, we of course caucused and organised within the EU. Sharing a negotiating position with 27 other countries, especially the Germans, French, Italians, Spanish and Portuguese, gave us great clout and reach at these UN talks. As a group, our collective historic relationships spanned most of the globe. Plus the European position is already high on climate ambition, not least following the internal EU 2030 agreements I brokered between 2013 and 2014, and the EU's recent adoption of net zero. Working closely with our European friends may be challenging to do for this government, especially during a year and the final weeks of the Brexit negotiations, but it is essential for the climate talks. China. Assuming the coronavirus is by then under control, and assuming there hasn't been a dramatic change of heart in Beijing, China could become an ally on ambition, a marked change of position from the past. Although the Chinese will not want to lead and go public early on pressing for ambition in countries' NDCs, they do now see economic and security benefits from the climate agenda, coupled with urgent health benefits from cleaning up urban air pollution. One of the greatest unsung climate achievements of the UK has been successive foreign secretaries, especially David Miliband and William Hague, allocating significant resource to climate diplomacy in Beijing and Shanghai. And my advice to the current government would be to reinvigorate such diplomacy as soon as possible. India. India is vital in and of itself to any final agreement, but also because of the influence she has elsewhere. The increasing controversies surrounding Prime Minister Modi may or may not make him more willing to lead initiatives. It's genuinely difficult to tell. Yet significant diplomatic effort to create a moment in the Glasgow sun for the Indian delegation could reap rewards for the crop. Modi gets climate change more than any previous Indian Prime Minister. He has written 2 works on his environmental policies, both called Convenient Action, a play on words with Al Gore's Inconvenient Truths. And solar and wind power are growing exponentially across India, and Modi may well now be thinking of his own personal legacy. Finally, the US. So much depends on what happens on Tuesday the 3rd of November. Though any climate diplomat should hope for the best and plan for the worst. And the worst means, of course, Trump too. The hope must be the Republican Party's political calculations around energy have moved in the last 4 years. Wishful thinking, though that may be. But with the rise of Tesla, with solar and wind now producing 10% of US power and growing fast, and with the impact of climate change an even greater issue for key Republican bases like US farmers and the US military, there are arguments that can be used, and they should be. But you can tell by this whistle-stop tour of the world's major powers that there's a lot of diplomatic work to do. The question is, will Prime Minister Johnson be willing to spend sufficient high levels of his political capital abroad on these climate talks, ahead of Brexit and ahead of trade deals? Johnson needs to go to Beijing. Johnson needs to go to New Delhi. Will he do that? The jury is out, but it must be our collective job to push him every day of every week throughout this critical year. Let me conclude. Could the UK regain global leadership on the climate emergency? It's certainly politically possible, but it will require a dramatic change of pace from the government. Whether on domestic climate policy, when March's budget will be a clear test, or an engagement with the British public, where ministers need to open up the process very soon to civil society. Or finally on diplomacy, where we must begin to see an urgent intensification of effort this spring, or the opportunity may be lost before we even get to Glasgow. For my part, I and my party will make campaigning for emergency action at COP26 the top priority for our work in 2020. And I hope many of you, the organisations you represent, will do so too. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sir Ed Davey. Sir Ed Davey has kindly offered to answer some questions in the next 10 minutes. So please, if you've got questions, we're going to take them in the batch of 3.
With no mics. Okay, fine. I have a loud voice anyway.
Yeah.
Ed, firstly, thank you very much for that. But I'd like to focus a little bit more, firstly, on climate justice. Liberal International, which I'm the Vice President, has set up a climate justice committee. Your former SPAD, Duncan, is the British leading member on it. And we are really trying to make sure that it helps developing countries be able to contribute to the world's decarbonisation, that's on the one hand. Secondly is the question that worries me very much on circular economy. The whole question is we are building up more and more problematic waste. For example, solar panels contain loads of metals and products which are difficult to recycle, if at all. You've got the oil platforms. Years ago, I told the government they should have insurances on it so that decommissioning went into the whole business cycle. And the same thing goes for batteries. A lot of batteries are very difficult to recycle. We should be treating waste as something that we can reuse and that is a good rather than evil, and stop dumping it overseas.
Thanks very much. Stefan?
40 years ago, I gained from Birkbeck an MA in applied linguistics, which really gave me street cred during a career teaching English at the BBC. When I retired, I came back to Birkbeck and did a diploma in archaeology, which later led me up to a Neolithic site in Orkney, from which I was able to view boats belonging to the European Marine Energy Consortium lowering turbines into the rather turbulent waters of Orkney to see basically whether they worked or whether they got stuck down. It's an incredibly interesting and positive advance, an international one, obviously. My question actually doesn't refer to that. It refers to the fact that at the time of the Paris talks, I was in Paris a lot, and there was a real buzz about the place and about France, which was really proud about holding those Paris talks. Everybody knew about it. How many people in Britain, Ed, today know that there is going to be an important climate conference in Glasgow?
Okay, the last question.
Yes. Ed, thank you for that. Your analysis of what needs to be done is very thorough, but it could be said it's a bit nation-focused. Companies and industries actually pollute as much as nations. So is there some other angle that is being taken to make sure that the market, which you mentioned, industries and individual corporations, are also included in target setting and monitoring?
First, on climate justice, it's absolutely essential the transition has fairness and justice at its heart. And that's particularly relevant internationally, although I would say it's also relevant within our own country, because it's an opportunity to help the few poor, and we also have to recognise that some industries are going to decline. We want to make sure that communities where jobs come from are also looked after as well. So there's climate justice on a wide scale. But your question was an international one primarily. Quite a lot of work has been done over the years on trying to do that, with the two major parts being, of course, mitigation, trying to help countries reduce their requirements for using fossil fuels as they grow, and also on adaptation, because a lot of climate change is already happening and affecting many of the most poorest and the most vulnerable in our world, and we need to assist them to adapt to that climate change, which we won't be able to stop. And there's been a number of international funds, some with the multinational development banks, some with the Green Climate Fund that we set up in 2014, and then some bilateral monies. And actually the UK has been right at the top of the global league in providing money through our International Climate Fund. When I think about how we promote that, I think sometimes what we need to provide isn't just money, but know-how and training. Maybe there's a course here for Birkbeck, I don't know. We in this country have some amazing scientists, some amazing engineers. For example, our meteorological office is the world leader in forecasting weather and has done world-leading science on predicting the impact of climate change on weather, on floods and so on. And I think we need to almost internationalise that know-how as a gift, as it were, to the world to help manage some of the issues around climate justice. So it has to be part of the narrative. Indeed, when you're at these COP talks, which can go on for a long, long time, often always longer than they're scheduled to go on for, it is obvious that the developing countries rightly look at us and say, well, hold on a minute, you put it all up there, you need to help us. And that's particularly the case with a number of small Pacific islands where climate change is an existential threat. So we have to engage in that, and that is going to need cash, but I think it also needs to need know-how. You also talked about waste. I clearly agree with you. I think there's quite a lot of work being done now on how we reuse, repurpose, recycle a lot of the renewable technologies, whether it's in solar panels or batteries. Clearly more needs to be done. But I would say we're at a relatively early stage of this. And in batteries, for example, the innovation, different chemistries, is extraordinary. And we all think about lithium ion, but I would have a very good bet that in 10 years' time, lithium ion will seem very old technology and will be using elements which are probably more widely available, more cheaply available, and more easy to recycle and reuse. And it's that innovation that I find really exciting. There's much more innovation going on in this area than I think people realise. Obviously, public money needs to go into there, but there are a number of people like Elon Musk who are getting there quite quickly too. You mentioned the question about the buzz in Paris. I have to make a confession. I was in Paris during those talks, but I wasn't a minister. I've been a minister for 3 previous talks, but I went on an enforced sabbatical in May 2015 when I lost my seat. And so, although I'd done a lot of preparatory work for Paris, I wasn't there. So I got a bit fed up with that. So I rang up the international climate team, who I knew very well from my time, and said, which hotel are you staying in at? And I booked into that hotel. I have to say, I tried to get accreditation for the talks, and they realised I wasn't a journalist. And so I'm afraid I didn't get into the talks, but I had a long time talking to our negotiating team. The minister at the time, when she came, it was Amber Rudd, came and saw me at the bar of the British Hotel. I don't think she was that pleased to see me. But there was a real buzz about Paris. There's no doubt about it. Once the talks were concluded successfully, there was quite a lot of partying as well, I can assure you. Will that happen here? I don't know. There's certainly not that buzz at the moment. And I think it's quite important that we do try to create that buzz. Because I think that's part of the pressure on the government that we need to make. And I think it can be an exciting moment. I mean, we want these talks to be successful. I mean, that would be fantastic. If Glasgow was another Paris, no one would be happier than me. Even if I have to give Boris Johnson the credit, which I'll have to do through gritty teeth. But nevertheless, it's too important to make it a partisan issue. Ultimately, we've got to get that buzz, and we've got to get some progress. You mentioned the issue about this is not just about nations; it's about business and so on. I like to think I did touch on that quite a lot in my talk, because when I talk about decarbonising capitalism, I'm talking about going right to the heart of our economic system. And one of the reasons I want to do that is to actually think that's the right way. Lots of people talk about carbon taxes and carbon pricing. And I'm actually in favour of those where they can be made to work. And that's an important proviso, because often they haven't been made to work. But actually one could go further back in the investment cycle, which is what I'm proposing. Because if you have the right regulations on investors in all the different financial markets, the way that capital was deployed in every business would have to meet climate tests. And that's what I think we need to do. We need to have a whole economic system. We can reinvent the way the economy works, so it has to take account of climate risk. It cannot be right that companies can invest billions of pounds in oil and gas we no longer need. I mean, this issue of...
I was thinking about the automotive industry as you were speaking in your remarks, accelerating what they need to do.
Well, and that's why I think, the government's, treating itself by bringing the ban on sale of new petrol diesel cars to 2035. Well, if we join lots of other people in 2030, you would see the automotive industry react, and react fast. And so regulations and things like auctions we do in wind power can have a dramatic impact. What business need to know? They need to know what are the rules of the game. And when you talk to them, they say, well, look, Okay, you invent the rules, just tell us what they are, keep to them, and then we can innovate, and we can invest. And if you have regulation, whether bans or other milestones, far enough ahead, then they can cope with that. And most people I've spoken to think that 2030 is completely doable. Many parts of the automotive industry globally are already adapting to electric vehicles. It would only give them just that extra spur and assist them to get the capital allocated in the right way, in the right scale.
Thanks very much for that. I think we've taken our 10 minutes, but I think we can take another
one more round. Yeah.
So, one more.
Yeah, thank you. I'm an international student from the DRC under British scholarship. So thanks to the British taxpayers here. My question is about the actors that you mentioned. And I'm quite a bit skeptic about how would UK get to take China to act on ethics basis to reduce or to jeopardize their transformation so as to address climate changes questions or to bring back on the table Mr. Trump. And my question is, what about other actors, climate actors, disposing with natural resources, countries like mine, the DR Congo, or countries like Brazil? To what extent will the British diplomacy address the relationship with them?
Sorry, can I just check on the question, that last bit. What are you wanting the British to do with DRC or Brazil?
How will the British policy address its relationship with these actors, the climate actors with natural resources?
Okay.
Thank you for the speech. I totally get why you would suggest developing diplomacy with the nations that you mentioned. However, the Middle East isn't mentioned in your list, nor, at a wider sense, is OPEC. I don't think they're going to be as passive as one might think, and any suggestions how they might be approached?
Okay.
I would like to ask whether you think there might be an elephant in the room that nobody's mentioned and that needs to be considered, which is population growth and what can be done about that. Both population growth in terms of demands on the economy and also congestion and urban transportation and all of that. My background, I've got an LS in London School of Economics first degree and I've got a master's degree from Birkbeck in European history.
Okay, there are two parts to your question. Can we get countries like China and the US to listen to us without diplomacy? And if we can't, or if we can, what work can we do with those countries that are resource intensive that we can quite be part of this debate? I think we can get the US and China to move. I'm not saying we'll be able to get them to move fast enough. And particularly with Trump, we have a particularly difficult correspondent. China, however, is moving because it is realising that it's in its own interest to move. So China is not altruistic. It's not a great supporter of human rights. I think we can say that. But successfully has realised that its east coast is very exposed to sea level rise. It realises that air pollution in its big cities, be they Beijing, Shanghai or many others, is actually killing their own people. Air pollution is probably one of the most significant factors. When you go back to the Communist Party's Congress, when President Xi was chosen, the buzzwords at that Congress were ecological civilization. At my first UN conference, I asked the Chinese minister, what did they mean by ecological civilization, wanting to build one, because I thought it was quite relevant to the climate debate. And he said, Ask me next year and I'll tell you. The point was, though, the political question for me was, why were the Chinese Communist Party at their conference in the Congress debating an ecological civilization? It was for this reason. The largest number of civil protests against communist rule in different provinces, towns and cities were related to the environment. Because if you have a one-child-only policy, and the water is polluted, and the ground is polluted, and the air is polluted, you're not thinking that your child is going to have a great future. And so a lot of the civil protests, just going back a little while now, had at the heart environmental issues. I'm just painting you a picture of why China has moved and could be persuaded to move further. I'm not here to praise the Chinese government, right? I'm just trying to describe the opportunity. And China used to be the most difficult country to work with. But it has moved, and we need to help it move. And I think proactive engagement could move it further. But that is not to say we shouldn't engage with DRC and Brazil and other such countries, both because obviously some of the elements of some of the new technologies are within the ground there, but also because both those countries have massive forests, which are going to be critical carbon sinks. And if you see the forest burning or being exploited and chopped down, that is a major problem. And a lot of the work we did, and the government continues to do, is on forests. About 20% actually of our climate funds are on trying to get forest projects. And there are grocery alliances where a lot of the big grocers around the world have signed up to source products, the products they use, without, in sustainable ways, and without seeing any trees chopped down in the rainforest. So there are actions we can take. They do require engagement with DRC, with Brazil, but I don't think they are either or. I think they're all essential, and this is an emergency. We have to gear up and do everything we can. The Middle East is a great question. My global tour wasn't completely everywhere, and there are some real difficult countries at UN talks. You could have mentioned Russia. Russia is a nightmare at these talks. Venezuela has never been terribly helpful. And you can see the commonality. These are the world's big holders of fossil fuel assets. And if you see the warmth between the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and President Putin, you begin to understand that they are working closely. I mean, remember the Lima COP, when we actually talked about these nationally determined contributions to the NDCs. They went through on the gavel by the president of the COP in Peru against the objection of Russia. Russia was trying to stop them right at the last minute. So you're absolutely right. These oil states are a huge problem in these talks and in making progress. There's no easy answer to that. There's been some work with Saudi to try to get them to invest in solar, which they are now doing. And there's some attempt to try and get over the argument that this is going to happen anyway, and it can either happen the easy way or the hard way, so are you going to get on board? But certainly Vladimir Putin is not interested. I'm yet to be convinced that the Saudis are. I don't have an answer to that, besides getting as many of the biggest countries together, and the smallest ones. Its size, its scale is hugely important. Now, these talks, you've got 195 countries, almost 200 countries, and you're trying to get a deal. And if Russia or Saudi Arabia is isolated, then the COP feels it can move on. It's not going to literally be hijacked by one country. So there are ways, the evidence is there, but it's not easy. But one of the reasons that I'm so keen on climate action, wouldn't it be a fantastic world when people like Vladimir Putin and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia didn't have so much money at their disposal? They don't seem to use it in the most friendly ways. So, if we tackle the climate emergency and we really go renewables across the world. I think it's one of the biggest impacts on tackling human poverty, and in terms of reducing conflict, because the power of these fossil fuel dictators will be reduced. Final question on population growth. It's a very good question. I don't actually think that it's impossible for the world to continue to grow in population, and that to be a huge barrier to tackling the climate issue. The real issue for me is, can we deploy this new technology at scale so the poorest in our world can have access to it? What would be an awful solution, and it goes back to the climate justice point, was if we sorted out threat of climate change and the world was basically as it is now. I believe if we do this right, some of the poorest people in our world can escape poverty. And the main example that people use is solar power in rural Africa, rural Latin America, rural Asia, where villages and towns have never really had access to electricity under the fossil fuel system, because people were never going to give it to them because they were too poor. Solar power, whether it's solar lamps, solar electricity, holds a real opportunity for those populations. And done correctly, I don't see population growth as a barrier. What I do see is ensuring that this transition to a zero carbon world is done in as just a way as possible, and is seen as reaching out to everyone in the world. And that it may sound idealistic, but actually it is now possible. Let me give you one final answer, which hopefully will be ending on an optimistic note. A lot of people in rural Africa, where they don't have electricity, they use different types of oil for their light. And that can give off fumes, which is bad for their health. It's in naked lamps, and there's danger. And of course, it has to be imported, which is bad for the country's balance of trade, and also it's quite expensive. The payback period on good solar lamps, like it's just the word good, because not all solar lamps are brilliant, but the payback period on good solar lamps can be about 3 months. And then they have lighting for a long time. It's clean, it doesn't harm their health, and it's safe. And the real challenges in bringing that type of technology to a lot of African countries has been the vested interests on the people who are currently supplying that particular oil from fossil fuel. And there are problems in different markets if you look at different countries in Africa to deploy this technology. But if we can work with African governments and they can work with these new industries, I think we can deploy this technology in a way which I think could be transformative and very positive.
Yes, it remains for me to, on your collective behalf, thank our speaker for the evening, Sir Ed Davey, for a truly authoritative and insightful lecture. It was a pleasure listening and watching a master at work. So, David, I don't mean you. I mean, very, very few people on the planet have as much grasp of the policy issues surrounding climate change, climate emergency as Sir Ed Davey. And we could all see, why he continues to maintain very high amount of respect in policy circles as far as these issues are concerned. So I'm sure that you would like to join me in a very warm round of applause for our speaker. Please also join me in extending some thanks to the organizers of this evening, I don't want to mention so many names, but I must mention Helen Shaw, and her team. And the master is heading our 200th anniversary preparation, and this is a subset of what we have coming down the pike, down the stream. Coming down the pike is American. And so this is one of those one event in the series that we are planning in the next 4 years to celebrate our 200th anniversary. And the BI is the host of this evening. The different schools have been hosting different evenings, and this is BI's day. And the executive dean and his team, everybody have been part of this, and we're very appreciative of all the support and the entire event team at Birkbeck. So could you please join me and get questions? So thanks everyone for coming and for being a very, very engaged audience. Thanks for the question, very insightful, very constructive. Birkbeck is an institution that teaches 6 to 9 in the evening. So the evening is still pretty young. We're only about 7 or 10, 17. So please, for the next 15 minutes or so, we have some drinks and opportunities for networking. Please run away. And thanks again for coming, and see you after.